Chapter 1, The Morning Shift. The coffee maker gurgled its familiar song at 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before Sarah Chen's alarm was set to go off. She'd learned to time it that way, wake to the smell instead of the sound. Small victories mattered when you worked the opening shift at a water treatment facility in a town most people had never heard of. Millbrook, Pennsylvania sat in one of those forgotten valleys where the Appalachian foothills began their gentle descent toward the Ohio border. Population 8,200. 2 traffic lights. 1 high school. The kind of place where people still waved at strangers and left their doors unlocked, though Sarah had noticed more folks were starting to bolt them at night. The news did that to people, she thought. All those reports about foreign interference, cybersecurity threats, infrastructure vulnerabilities. It made even the safest places feel a little less safe. She poured her coffee into the thermos with the faded Steelers logo, a gift from her father before he passed, and stood at the kitchen window watching the dark street slowly materialize in the pre-dawn gray. The Hendersons' porch light was on. It was always on. Bill Henderson had installed it after his wife died, said he couldn't stand coming home to a dark house anymore. That was 7 years ago. The light still burned every night. Sarah's reflection stared back at her from the window, superimposed over the sleeping street. 38 years old. Dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. The kind of face that disappeared in crowds, which she'd never minded. Her ex-husband used to say she had quiet features, which she'd taken as a compliment until she realized he meant forgettable. The divorce had been finalized 2 years ago. He'd moved to Pittsburgh, remarried within 8 months. She'd stayed in Millbrook, kept the house, kept the job, kept the life they'd built together minus the person she'd built it with. Sometimes that felt like victory. Sometimes it felt like she'd won a prize she no longer wanted. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Marcus Webb, her supervisor at the facility. Early meeting today. 7 a.m. Mandatory. Don't be late. She frowned. Marcus wasn't the type to call mandatory meetings without explanation. In the 4 years she'd worked under him, he'd called exactly 2, once when the EPA inspectors were coming, and once when they'd had to implement new security protocols after that power plant hack in Florida. The one the news had covered for 3 weeks straight before moving on to the next catastrophe. Sarah texted back a thumbs up, drained half her coffee standing at the counter, and grabbed her jacket from the hook by the door. The fabric still smelled faintly of the chlorine solution they used in the treatment tanks. The smell never quite washed out. Outside, the November air bit at her cheeks. Her breath formed small clouds that dissipated into the darkness. Frost had settled on the windshield of her Civic overnight, and she stood in the driveway running the defroster while her mind wandered to the meeting. Probably another security update. They'd been getting a lot of those lately. New password requirements. New badge protocols. Background checks that went back further and dug deeper than they used to. The facility was 12 minutes from her house if you hit the lights right. This early, the roads belonged to her and the occasional semi hauling goods down Route 22. She knew every curve, every pothole, every spot where deer liked to dart across the asphalt. This was her commute, her routine, her life measured in familiar landmarks and repeated motions. The Millbrook Water Treatment Facility sat on 18 acres at the edge of town, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had been upgraded last year to include razor wire and motion sensors. The transformation had been gradual enough that most people hadn't noticed. First the cameras. Then the new gate. Then the fence modifications. Each change had been explained away as standard modernization, keeping pace with industry standards, nothing to worry about. Sarah badged in through the main entrance at 6:52 a.m. The building smelled like it always did, a mixture of concrete, chemicals, and the particular sterile cleanliness of a place where contamination could mean disaster. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor toward the conference room, where she could already hear voices. Marcus was there, along with the rest of the senior operations team. Tom Bradshaw from maintenance, 62, and counting the days until retirement. Jennifer Hoskins from quality control, sharp as a tack and twice as direct. David Park from systems management, who'd moved here from California 3 years ago and still complained about the winters. And 2 people Sarah didn't recognize. The strangers wore suits that looked expensive and uncomfortable. The woman was maybe 50, with steel gray hair cut in a precise bob and eyes that catalogued everything they touched. The man was younger, mid-30s, with the kind of military posture that never fully relaxed even when sitting down. "Sarah, thanks for coming in early." Marcus gestured to an empty chair. His voice had that tight quality it got when he was stressed but trying not to show it. "Have a seat. We're waiting on Luis, and then we'll get started." Luis Dominguez arrived 2 minutes later, still pulling on his work jacket. He was the youngest member of the team at 29, fresh out of engineering school and eager in a way that reminded Sarah of herself a decade ago. He slid into the chair next to her and whispered, "What's this about?" Sarah shook her head slightly. "No idea." Marcus closed the conference room door and stood at the head of the table. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made everyone look slightly ill. "I'll keep this brief," Marcus said. "These are federal investigators. They're here to conduct a security audit of our facility. Full access, full cooperation. This is not optional, and it's not up for debate." The woman in the gray suit stood. When she spoke, her voice had the careful neutrality of someone trained to reveal nothing through inflection. "My name is Agent Catherine Voss. This is Agent Ryan Chen. We're with the Department of Homeland Security, Infrastructure Security Division. Over the next several weeks, we'll be conducting comprehensive audits of critical infrastructure facilities in this region. Your facility has been selected as part of this initiative." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Comprehensive audits. Critical infrastructure. These were phrases that appeared in news articles about foreign threats and domestic terrorism, not in her quiet life in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Tom Bradshaw raised his hand like a student in class. "Is there a specific threat we should know about?" Agent Voss's expression didn't change. "This is a precautionary measure. We've identified potential vulnerabilities in regional water systems. Our job is to assess those vulnerabilities and recommend protective measures." "Potential vulnerabilities from what?" Jennifer asked. She'd crossed her arms over her chest, her face settling into that skeptical expression Sarah had seen her use during budget meetings when corporate tried to cut corners. "That's classified information," Agent Chen said. His voice was younger than his partner's but no less controlled. "What I can tell you is that we need complete access to your systems, your logs, your personnel files, and your facility operations. We'll be interviewing each of you individually. We'll need passwords, access codes, and detailed information about your protocols." David Park leaned forward. "Our systems are isolated. Air-gapped from external networks. We updated all our cybersecurity measures last year after the Florida incident," Agent Voss finished. "Yes, we're aware. We're also aware that air-gapped systems aren't as secure as people think. We're not here to debate your current security measures. We're here to evaluate them." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but Sarah barely heard the rest. Her mind had snagged on something Agent Voss had said: potential vulnerabilities in regional water systems. Not their system. Regional systems. Plural. Which meant this wasn't just about Millbrook. This was bigger. When they were finally dismissed, Sarah walked back to her station in a daze. The facility suddenly felt different, like seeing your house through a stranger's eyes and noticing all the cracks in the foundation you'd learned to ignore. She'd worked here for 4 years. She knew every pipe, every valve, every gallon per minute flow rate. She knew the hum of the pumps and the exact sound they made when something was wrong. But standing in the control room, watching the monitors display their endless streams of data, she realized she'd never thought about what would happen if someone wanted to hurt them. Really hurt them. Not a breakdown or a malfunction, but an attack. An intentional poisoning of the water that served 8,200 people who trusted it to be safe every time they turned on their taps. Luis appeared beside her, staring at the same monitors. "You think it's serious?" he asked. Sarah thought about Agent Voss's eyes, the way they'd catalogued every reaction in that conference room like evidence being filed away. She thought about the razor wire on the fence and the new badges and all the small changes that had seemed like nothing until you added them up. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think it's serious." Outside the control room window, the sun was finally rising over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It looked like any other morning in any other small town in America. Beautiful. Peaceful. Safe. Sarah turned back to her monitors and got to work, trying to ignore the feeling that something had already changed, that they'd crossed some invisible line between before and after, and there was no going back. Chapter 2, Disruption. The federal agents settled into the facility like winter fog, pervasive, chilling, impossible to ignore. They commandeered the small conference room on the second floor, transforming it into a command center filled with laptops, external hard drives, and equipment Sarah didn't recognize. Within 3 days, they'd interviewed every member of the staff, some more than once. Sarah's first interview lasted 2 hours. Agent Voss had asked questions that seemed innocuous on the surface but left her feeling exposed, like someone had rifled through her medicine cabinet and desk drawers. How long had she lived in Millbrook? Did she have family in the area? Had she traveled internationally in the past 5 years? Did she know anyone who worked in other infrastructure facilities? Had anyone ever asked her unusual questions about the water treatment process? That last question had stuck with her. The way Voss had asked it, casual but watchful, suggested there was a right answer and a wrong one, though Sarah had no idea which was which. "No," she'd said honestly. "Most people's eyes glaze over when I mention what I do for a living." Voss had made a note. Sarah had tried not to wonder what it said. The second week brought new routines. Badge scanners at interior doors that had never been locked before. Escorts required for anyone moving between sections. A new protocol that required two-person verification for any system changes, no matter how minor. Marcus had implemented each directive without comment, his jaw tight with the kind of tension that suggested he knew more than he was saying. On a gray Thursday afternoon, Sarah found Jennifer Hoskins in the break room, staring at her coffee like it held answers. "They're in the archives," Jennifer said without preamble. "Going through 5 years of water quality reports. Every test, every reading, every maintenance log." Sarah poured her own coffee, watching the steam rise. "Looking for what?" "That's what I asked Agent Chen. He said they're establishing baseline patterns." Jennifer's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Baseline patterns. Like we're a suspect instead of the people who keep this town from getting dysentery. Maybe that's not what they're looking for." Jennifer turned to face her. "Then what?" Sarah had been thinking about this for days, puzzle pieces clicking together in ways she didn't like. What if they're not looking for what we did wrong? What if they're looking for what someone else might have done? The silence stretched between them. Through the break room window, Sarah could see the filtration tanks, their massive cylindrical form stark against the overcast sky. 30 million gallons of water moved through this facility every day. 30 million gallons that went to homes, schools, hospitals, restaurants. To every tap in Millbrook and 3 surrounding townships. "You mean sabotage," Jennifer said finally. "I mean, I don't know what I mean. But they're treating this place like a crime scene where the crime hasn't happened yet." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her dark bedroom, listening to the house settle around her, and thought about water. How invisible it was, how trusted. How easy it would be to contaminate it if you knew what you were doing. The chemicals they used in treatment, chlorine, fluoride, aluminum sulfate, were carefully balanced to purify without poisoning. But those same chemicals, in different quantities or combinations, could kill. She'd never thought about it before. Never had to. Her job was to make the water safe, not to imagine all the ways someone could make it deadly. At 2 a.m., she gave up on sleep and went downstairs. Her laptop sat on the kitchen table where she'd left it, and she opened it without letting herself think too hard about what she was doing. The search terms felt paranoid even as she typed them: water infrastructure attacks, domestic terrorism, water supply, chemical contamination, intentional. The results were worse than she'd imagined. A reservoir in Oregon poisoned by antifreeze in 2015. A treatment plant in Kansas where an ex-employee had attempted to override safety controls. International incidents where water systems had been weaponized during conflicts. And dozens of articles about cybersecurity vulnerabilities, about how modern treatment facilities, computerized, networked, efficient, were also potentially fragile. Sarah closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of her kitchen, feeling the familiar contours of her life shift into something foreign and frightening. She thought about Bill Henderson's porch light across the street, burning against the dark. She thought about Marcus's tight jaw and Agent Voss's cataloging eyes. She thought about 30 million gallons of water and 8,200 people who trusted it completely. The next morning, she arrived at the facility to find police cars in the parking lot. Marcus met her at the entrance, his face gray. "Don't badge in yet. They're doing a sweep." A sweep for what? They found something in the system logs. An unauthorized access attempt. 3 weeks ago. Sarah's mouth went dry. From where? They won't tell me. Voss just said the attempt was blocked, but it was sophisticated. Professional. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. Jesus, Sarah. Someone tried to hack into our water system. The morning dissolved into chaos. The entire staff was assembled in the parking lot while K-9 units swept the building. Agent Voss and Agent Chen moved through the facility with a team of technicians, pulling hard drives, imaging systems, treating their workplace like an active threat. Louis stood next to Sarah, his usual enthusiasm replaced by something that looked like fear. "This is insane," he muttered. "This is actually insane." Tom Bradshaw, who'd been chain-smoking since they'd been evacuated, flicked his cigarette into the gravel. "Told my wife last year we should move closer to our daughter in Vermont. She said I was being paranoid. Guess I wasn't paranoid enough." By noon, they were allowed back inside, though the atmosphere had changed completely. The facility no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a target. Sarah sat at her station, staring at the monitors that suddenly seemed less like tools and more like vulnerabilities. Every digital readout, every automated control, every networked system, all of it was a potential entry point for someone who knew what they were doing. Agent Voss appeared beside her so quietly that Sarah jumped. "Ms. Chen, I need you to walk me through your access protocols. Every login, every override, every time you've made a manual adjustment in the past 6 months. Why? You think I think someone got into your system, and I need to know how." Voss's expression was unreadable. "This isn't about blame. It's about protection. So please, walk me through everything." For the next 3 hours, Sarah reconstructed her digital footprint while Voss took notes and asked questions that grew increasingly specific. By the time they finished, Sarah's head was pounding and her hands were shaking. She drove home in the late afternoon darkness, November stealing the daylight earlier each day, and sat in her driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. The Hendersons' porch light was already on. The street looked exactly as it always had, quiet, ordinary, safe. But Sarah knew better now. She knew that safety was an illusion, that threats could be invisible, that the enemy might not announce itself with bombs or bullets but with silent intrusions into the systems people trusted most. Inside her house, she locked the door. Then checked it twice to make sure. Chapter 3, Revelation. The town hall meeting was announced on a Tuesday and held on Thursday evening, leaving just enough time for rumors to spread like contagion through Millbrook's close-knit community. Sarah heard 3 different versions of what had happened before she even arrived at the high school gymnasium where the meeting was being held. Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store said terrorists had planted bombs in the water supply. The mechanic who rotated her tires claimed it was Chinese hackers. Her neighbor, walking his dog past her house, speculated it was an inside job, someone with a grudge against the town. None of them were completely wrong. That was the part that made Sarah's stomach clench as she walked through the gymnasium doors. The space was packed. Every folding chair was occupied, and people lined the walls 3 deep. Sarah recognized faces she'd seen her entire life: the woman who taught her high school English, the guy who delivered her mail, families with small children who shouldn't have to worry about whether their tap water was safe to drink. The air was thick with anxiety and the particular tension that comes when people realize the ground beneath them isn't as solid as they'd believed. At the front of the room, a long table had been set up. Mayor Richard Kowalski sat in the center, flanked by Agent Voss and Agent Chen. Marcus was there too, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 2 weeks. Chief of Police Helen Brennan occupied the far end, her uniform crisp but her expression worried. Mayor Kowalski called the meeting to order, though it took several minutes for the crowd to quiet. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone delivering news he wished he didn't have to share. "Thank you all for coming. I know there's been a lot of speculation, and you deserve the truth. 3 weeks ago, our water treatment facility experienced an attempted cyber attack. The attack was blocked by our security systems, but it was sophisticated and deliberate. The federal government has been conducting an investigation, and tonight, they're going to brief us on what they've found." The gymnasium erupted. Questions shouted from every direction, voices overlapping into incomprehensible noise. Sarah watched Agent Voss wait patiently for the chaos to subside, her expression revealing nothing. When the room finally quieted, Voss stood. "My name is Catherine Voss, Department of Homeland Security. What I'm about to tell you is based on an ongoing investigation, so I can't share every detail. But you deserve to know what we know." She clicked a remote, and a projection screen behind her lit up with a map of Pennsylvania, red dots scattered across it like a rash. Sarah counted 12 dots before Voss continued. "These are water treatment facilities in this region that have experienced similar unauthorized access attempts over the past 4 months. Millbrook is one of 12. The attacks were coordinated, sophisticated, and targeted specifically at facilities serving populations between 5 and 15,000 people." A woman in the 3rd row raised her hand, her voice shaking. "Who's doing this?" "We're still determining attribution," Voss said. "What we know is that the attack vectors were consistent, suggesting a single actor or coordinated group. The attempts were designed to gain access to operational controls, specifically, chemical dosing systems and filtration protocols." Sarah felt the room temperature drop. Chemical dosing systems. That meant someone had tried to access the exact controls that regulated how much chlorine, fluoride, and other chemicals went into the water supply. Too much of any of them could sicken thousands. The right combination could kill. "Was our water poisoned?" a man called out from the back. "No," Marcus said, standing up. His voice was firm, the voice of someone who'd been waiting for this question. "The attack was blocked. Our water has been safe to drink throughout this entire period. We've run additional tests every single day since this began. Your water is safe. But it could have been poisoned," someone else said. "If they'd gotten in." "But they didn't get in," Voss interrupted. "The security protocols worked. However, that doesn't mean we can be complacent. Which is why I need to tell you the rest." The silence was absolute now. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. "We believe these attacks are part of a larger domestic terrorism campaign. Not foreign actors, domestic. American citizens targeting American infrastructure in smaller communities that might not have the resources of major cities." The words landed like physical blows. Domestic terrorism. Americans targeting Americans. The enemy within. The profile we've developed suggests individuals with technical expertise, possibly former infrastructure employees or military, who have been radicalized by extremist ideology. They're targeting towns like yours specifically because they believe smaller communities are softer targets and because the psychological impact of attacking ordinary America serves their narrative. Sarah thought about the people she'd seen every day for 4 years. Tom, counting down to retirement. Jennifer, who brought in homemade cookies for the staff. Luis, who still got excited about new filtration technology. Marcus, who coached Little League on weekends. Could any of them? No. She forced the thought away. That was exactly what terrorism did, made you suspect everyone, trust no one, see threats in familiar faces. But someone had tried to hack their system. Someone with knowledge and skill and intent to harm. Chief Brennan stood next, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years in law enforcement. We're implementing new security measures immediately. Increased patrols around the facility. Background checks for all infrastructure employees, not just at the water treatment plant but at the power station and telecommunications hub. We're also asking for your help. If you see anything unusual, strangers asking questions about infrastructure, suspicious activity near utility sites, even online discussions that raise red flags, report it. You're asking us to spy on our neighbors, someone said bitterly. I'm asking you to protect your neighbors, Brennan replied. There's a difference. The meeting lasted another hour, dissolving into smaller conversations and individual questions. Sarah stood near the back, watching people process information that fundamentally altered their understanding of their own safety. She saw fear, anger, confusion. She saw parents holding their children a little tighter. She saw elderly couples who'd lived in Millbrook their entire lives looking around the gymnasium like they no longer recognized the place. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find David Park, the systems manager from California. His face was pale, and his eyes had the slightly wild look of someone holding on to composure by a thread. I need to tell you something, he said quietly. Not here. Can you meet me tomorrow? Somewhere private? David, what? Not here, he repeated, glancing around. Please. It's important. Before Sarah could respond, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving her standing alone with a new weight of dread settling in her chest. She drove home through streets that looked the same as always but felt different now. Every parked car could be surveilling the facility. Every lit window could hide someone researching attack vectors. Every neighbor could be a threat. The Hendersons' porch light burned bright across the street, a small beacon against the darkness. Sarah stood at her own dark window and wondered if Bill Henderson had heard the news yet. Wondered if he'd lock his door tonight. Wondered if any of them would ever feel truly safe again. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, staff meeting tomorrow, 6 a.m. New protocols effective immediately. Sarah looked at the message for a long time before typing back, I'll be there. Outside, Millbrook slept uneasily, a small town that had just learned it was important enough to be targeted, vulnerable enough to be afraid, and powerless enough to wonder who among them might be the enemy they'd been warned about. Chapter 4, Climax. Sarah arrived at the diner 40 minutes early, her nerves making sleep impossible after 4 a.m. The Bluebird Cafe sat on the edge of town, the kind of place that served breakfast all day and never asked questions. David had texted her the location at midnight with just 3 words, 7 a.m. Come alone. She ordered coffee she didn't want and watched the parking lot through the window. The morning shift waitress, Donna, who'd worked there for 20 years, moved between tables with practiced efficiency, refilling cups and making small talk about the weather. Normal life continuing while Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. David's Toyota pulled in at exactly 7. He sat in his car for a full minute before getting out, looking around the parking lot like a man expecting to be followed. When he slid into the booth across from Sarah, his hands were shaking. "I think I know who tried to hack the system," he said without preamble. Sarah's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "What?" "I've been going through the access logs. All of them, not just what I showed Voss and Chen. There's a pattern they didn't see because they don't know our system like I do." He pulled out his phone, shielding the screen from view. "Look at this. 3 weeks before the attempted breach, someone created a ghost account in our maintenance system. It had all the right permissions, all the right clearances. It looked legitimate because it was built from legitimate credentials." "Whose credentials?" David's face was gray. "Tom Bradshaw's." The name hit Sarah like cold water. Tom. 62 years old, counting days until retirement. Tom who'd worked at the facility for 18 years. Tom who knew every pipe, every valve, every backdoor in systems that had been upgraded around him. "That doesn't mean Tom did it," Sarah said, but her voice sounded uncertain even to herself. "I know. That's what I thought too. So I kept digging. The ghost account was created from an external IP address, routed through multiple proxies. Professional-level operational security. But here's the thing," David leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The account was created at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I checked Tom's badge logs. He was in the building that night. Logged in at 2:15 a.m., logged out at 4:30 a.m. His explanation was he couldn't sleep and came in to finish maintenance reports." "Did you tell Voss?" "Not yet. Because there's more." David's hands clenched on the table. "I found communications. Encrypted files buried in the maintenance system backup folders. I shouldn't have been able to decrypt them, but whoever put them there made a mistake with the key management. Sarah, they're talking about more than just Millbrook. They're planning something bigger. Multiple facilities. Simultaneous attacks." The diner suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. Sarah forced herself to breathe. "When?" The messages reference November 23rd, Thanksgiving week. "That's 6 days from now. You need to take this to Voss immediately." "I can't." David's voice cracked. "Because I don't know if I can trust her either." Sarah stared at him. "What are you talking about?" "One of the encrypted messages mentions our contact in federal oversight, helping to coordinate timing." "Sarah, what if the investigation itself is part of it? What if they're not here to stop the attack but to make sure it succeeds?" "That's insane. You're talking about federal agents. I'm talking about people. People who can be radicalized, recruited, compromised. You heard what Voss said at the town hall. Domestic terrorism. Former infrastructure employees or military. People with inside knowledge." He grabbed her wrist. "I need help. I can't go to Voss until I know more. But I can't do this alone." Sarah pulled her hand back, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed that this was beyond her, that she should run to the nearest authority and let them handle it. But which authority? Who could she trust if David was right? "What do you need me to do?" "Help me trace the communications. Find out who else is involved. We have 6 days to figure out if Tom is working alone or if there are others in the facility." David's eyes were desperate. "If we're wrong, we destroy an innocent man's life. If we're right and do nothing, thousands of people could die." The weight of it pressed down on Sarah's chest. She thought about Tom showing her pictures of his grandchildren. Tom complaining about his knees on cold mornings. Tom who'd been there longer than anyone, who knew more about the facility's vulnerabilities than anyone alive. "Okay," she heard herself say. "But we do this carefully. No accusations until we're certain." They spent the next hour in the parking lot of the diner, David's laptop balanced between them, going through files that Sarah only partially understood. The technical details blurred, but the implications were crystal clear. Someone had been systematically mapping the facility's weaknesses. Someone had been communicating with at least 3 other individuals using code words and dead drops in shared file systems. Someone had been planning this for months. And all the digital breadcrumbs led back to Tom Bradshaw's credentials. Sarah went to work that morning feeling like she was moving through water. Everything looked normal, the same monitors, the same protocols, the same faces. But she found herself watching Tom differently. The way he moved through the facility with absolute confidence. The way he accessed systems without hesitation. The way he'd been so calm when everyone else was panicking after the town hall meeting. Too calm, maybe. Or was she seeing conspiracy where there was only coincidence? At lunch, she found Marcus alone in his office, staring at reports he wasn't reading. "If you knew something," Sarah said carefully, "something that could either save lives or destroy an innocent person's reputation, what would you do?" Marcus looked up at her, and she saw the exhaustion carved into his face. "Is this about the investigation?" "It's about trust. About knowing who to believe when everything feels like it's falling apart." He was quiet for a long moment. "Before I took this job, I worked at a facility in Ohio. We had an incident, a chemical leak that made 40 people sick. It was an accident, equipment failure, no one's fault. But the investigation that followed tore that place apart. People turned on each other. Friendships destroyed. Careers ruined. All because everyone was so desperate to find someone to blame that they stopped seeing each other as human beings. What happened? The facility closed. The company settled lawsuits. The town never trusted water from any source again." Marcus met her eyes. "Whatever you know, Sarah, make sure you're right before you pull that trigger. Because you can't take it back." That night, Sarah and David met again, this time in the parking lot of the abandoned textile mill on the edge of town. David had more files, more evidence, more pieces of a puzzle that was taking a horrifying shape. "I found the target list," he said, his voice hollow. 12 facilities. All scheduled for simultaneous contamination on November 23 at 6 a.m., right when the morning shift starts adjustments. "The chemicals they're planning to use, Sarah, it's not just poisoning. It's mass casualty. Tens of thousands of people across Pennsylvania and Ohio could be affected." Sarah's hands had gone numb. "We have to tell someone. Police, FBI, someone." "I know. But look at this." He showed her another file. "Communications from yesterday. They know we're getting close. There's a message about loose ends and necessary sacrifices." David pulled up a final document, and Sarah's blood turned to ice. It was a list of names. Staff members from the Millbrook facility who might pose a threat to the operation. Her name was third from the top. David's was first. Chapter 5, Resolution and Reflection. The decision to trust Agent Voss was the hardest decision Sarah had ever made. But sitting in that parking lot, looking at her own name on a kill list, she realized they were out of options. If David was wrong about federal involvement, they'd look paranoid. If he was right, they were already dead. They called Voss at 11 p.m. She arrived alone 30 minutes later, her sedan pulling into the abandoned mill parking lot with headlights off. She listened to everything David had found, examined every file on his laptop, her face growing harder with each revelation. "Tom Bradshaw is one of ours," she said finally. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her. "What?" "Undercover. He's been embedded in infrastructure facilities across the region for 3 years, tracking a domestic cell we've been monitoring. We planted the vulnerabilities in his digital profile deliberately, bait to see who would take it." Voss's jaw tightened. "Someone did. And they used his credentials to build a shadow operation we didn't see coming. But the ghost account was created by someone else with access to Tom's information. Someone in the facility who knew him well enough to mimic his patterns." Voss looked at David. You said you found communications mentioning federal oversight. Show me exactly what you found. David pulled up the encrypted files. Voss read them, her face draining of color. She made a phone call, speaking in clipped sentences Sarah couldn't quite hear. When she hung up, she looked at them both with something Sarah had never seen in her eyes before: fear. We have a breach. Not in Millbrook, in the investigation itself. Agent Chen has been communicating with the cell. She said it flatly, like reading coordinates off a map. He's been feeding them information about our progress, helping them stay ahead of us. And according to these timestamps, he knows you found the files. Which means... The gunshot shattered the car window before Voss could finish. Sarah hit the ground on instinct, her ears ringing, her heart trying to punch through her ribs. David was beside her, and Voss was moving, weapon drawn, returning fire toward the tree line where muzzle flash had briefly illuminated the darkness. Get to my car! Voss shouted. Now! They ran in a crouch, Sarah's legs moving on pure adrenaline. More shots rang out, and she heard the whine of bullets passing too close. David stumbled, and Sarah grabbed his arm, hauling him forward. They dove behind Voss's sedan as another volley tore through the air where they'd been standing. Voss was on her phone, calling for backup, her voice steady despite the chaos. Sarah pressed herself against the cold metal of the car and tried to process what was happening. Someone was trying to kill them. Not hypothetically. Not theoretically. Actually trying to end their lives in a parking lot in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. How many? Voss called out. I see 2 shooters, David gasped. Maybe 3. The gunfire stopped. In the sudden silence, Sarah could hear her own ragged breathing and the distant sound of sirens. The shooters had heard them too. She saw shadows moving in the tree line, retreating. Voss didn't pursue. She stayed with Sarah and David until Chief Brennan arrived with 4 patrol cars, lights blazing, turning the abandoned mill into a crime scene. The next 72 hours blurred together. FBI agents flooded Millbrook. Agent Chen was arrested attempting to leave the state. Tom Bradshaw, revealed as Special Agent Thomas Bradford, coordinated raids on 4 locations simultaneously, pulling in members of a domestic terrorism cell that had been planning infrastructure attacks for 18 months. Sarah gave statements until her voice gave out. She walked investigators through everything she and David had found, every file, every connection, every terrible realization. She learned that the cell had recruited 11 people across different facilities, maintenance workers, engineers, even a water quality inspector. People who'd become radicalized online, who believed they were striking back against a government they saw as tyrannical, who'd convinced themselves that killing their neighbors was somehow patriotic. None of them were from Millbrook. That was what haunted Sarah most. The people trying to poison her town weren't foreign terrorists or shadowy operatives. They were Americans from places just like Millbrook, who'd been recruited through message boards and encrypted chats, who'd radicalized each other until mass murder seemed like revolution. The attacks were prevented. November 23 came and went with extra security at all 12 facilities. The water stayed safe. No one died from poison. But Sarah knew the real damage had already been done. She stood in the facility control room 3 weeks after the arrests, watching the same monitors she'd watched for 4 years. Everything was the same. Everything was different. They'd upgraded security again, more cameras, more protocols, more locked doors between her and the work she used to do without thinking about it. Marcus appeared beside her. He looked older now, the weight of what had almost happened carved into the lines around his eyes. Tom, Agent Bradford, came by yesterday, he said. Wanted to apologize for the deception. Said you and David saved thousands of lives. We got lucky, Sarah said. If David hadn't been obsessive about those logs, if we trusted the wrong person, if Chen had been faster. But none of that happened. You made the right calls. Sarah thought about all the calls she'd made. Trusting David. Doubting Tom. Betting everything on Agent Voss being clean when she could have been wrong. She thought about how thin the line was between disaster and survival. The town's different now, she said. People look at each other differently. They lock their doors. They question things they used to take for granted. Marcus nodded slowly. That's not entirely bad. We were too comfortable. Too trusting. Too certain that bad things happen somewhere else to someone else. But we've lost something too. That feeling that we were safe here. That Millbrook was too small, too insignificant to matter to anyone who wanted to cause harm. Maybe we were never really safe, Marcus said quietly. Maybe we were just lucky. And now we have to decide if we're going to live in fear or live with awareness. There's a difference. Sarah drove home that evening as winter darkness settled over Millbrook. The streets looked the same as always. The Hendersons' porch light was burning. People were walking dogs and carrying groceries and living their lives. But Sarah could see the small changes now. More porch lights left on. Fewer unlocked doors. The subtle tightening of a community that had learned it wasn't invisible after all. She parked in her driveway and sat for a moment, watching her street. Somewhere in America, there were probably others like the cell they'd stopped. Other people radicalizing, other plans forming, other small towns marked as targets by people who decided that destruction was the answer to problems Sarah couldn't even fully understand. The enemy wasn't overseas. It had never been overseas. It was in the comment sections and chat rooms, in the grievances that festered into hatred, in the minds of people who'd convinced themselves that their neighbors were enemies deserving of punishment. Sarah got out of her car and walked to her front door. She unlocked it, because she locked it now, every time, and stepped into her house. Safe for today. Safe for now. Safe until the next threat materialized from the places no one thought to look. She stood at her kitchen window and looked out at Millbrook. Her town. Still standing. Still breathing. Still trusting its water to be clean and its neighbors to be neighbors, even while knowing now that trust had to be earned and verified and protected, that safety was a choice made every day by people willing to watch, to question, to act when something felt wrong. The Hendersons' light burned steady across the street, a small defiance against the darkness. Sarah turned on her own porch light and left it burning. One more small light in a town learning to watch over itself, to protect what mattered, to understand that the enemy they'd feared was never as far away as they'd wanted to believe. And in the morning, she would go back to work, monitoring the water that 8,200 people would drink without thinking about it. She would do her job with the knowledge that it mattered, that vigilance mattered, that the ordinary work of ordinary people was sometimes all that stood between a community and catastrophe. The enemy was still out there. It always would be. But tonight, Millbrook was safe. And tomorrow, Sarah would make sure it stayed that way.